School safety on everybody's minds after the shootings in Florida. Joining us is the Executive Assistant Chief of the City of Phoenix, Mike Kurtenbach. Thanks for being with us, Chief.
Pleasure to be here, Mike.
So from the City of Phoenix standpoint, when you see these shootings anywhere in the country, it's got to be for you to be, in the executive part of the police department, you got to be mindful of your officers and what might happen here, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's horrific when you see these events unfold, as we've seen with far too much regularity around the country and most recently in Florida. And then it's incumbent upon us as an agency to ensure that our officers are equipped to the extent that we can equip them with how to handle a similar situation if it were to occur here.
You know, being as prepared as you can for a situation is necessary, but can you ever really prepare for a situation like that? Is it possible to do that?
We train. We try to train for every eventuality, but there are so many variables in a situation like that, Mike. You hope that you can revert back to your training and the tactics that you've learned so you can adapt to the scenario, but the reality is every situation is going to be different.
And without getting you into the debate too much about gun control, Arizona is very lenient, probably the most lenient in the country when it comes to firearms ownership. Does that change things for you with knowing that there are so many people armed in the city and what might happen in a potential situation like that?
So in a perfect situation, when you're dealing with that imperfect scenario right there, ideally it's only, and I'll be very simplistic, the good guys and the bad guys or bad girls that are armed at that point. And so what I mean is the blue suits that are responding to a situation, in this case, let's talk about what happened most recently, a subject with a gun who's inflicting mass casualties inside of a school. We want to go to that threat. We want to identify that threat, and we want to remedy that situation as quickly as possible. Other people may be very well intentioned in trying to stop that threat, but that just complicates things for the officers that are entering that very chaotic situation.
Are there school resource officers in the City of Phoenix in the schools?
Absolutely.
How is it, are there enough?
Well, if you look at all of our schools, when you talk about your traditional K-8 schools or your middle schools and your high schools and your charter schools, we're about 540 schools throughout the City of Phoenix alone. And we have 83 school resource officers. So doing simple math, we could use a lot more. No, there aren't enough.
And again, I've been a pretty big advocate about the staffing issues, and I just think that the City of Phoenix is the best run agency in the country. My brother's in law enforcement, so he doesn't like me saying that so much. He likes his agency. But it's the idea that it's such a professionally run agency, but it's tough sometimes to be everywhere you need to be, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I agree with you. And I'm unapologetic in my belief that this is the best police department in the nation. In May, I'll celebrate 28 years with the Phoenix Police Department, so I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe in this agency. And we pride ourselves on learning from other agencies and taking best practices here, but the reality, and again, I'm going to be unapologetic for a minute, is other agencies learn from us and how we do things too.
Does the agency have an official stance on the idea of arming teachers or even having armed security guards hired in the school system?
So let me address the issue of arming teachers first. Obviously, that's a policy decision for the schools, and we talk about charter schools, maybe on a micro level, for the state on a macro level. It's concerning, because going back to what we just talked about, if officers are responding to that situation where there is an armed subject inside of a school, we would like to know how many guns there are inside the school.
Right.
If there are teachers that are armed as well, that could be inherently problematic for us as we're trying to deal with that scenario. And there's a lot of responsibility on that teacher.
Sure.
There's a lot of responsibility on the school administration as well. But I'm also not naive enough to not believe that there are teachers that have military experience, have prior law enforcement experience to where it may be appropriate. The key is communication. Now, the second part of what you talked about having maybe retired police officers that are in schools or military veterans in schools, that's something that we as an agency are already looking at. Going back to your point before of where I mentioned over 500 schools, 540 schools, 83 school resource officers, there's not enough. So where are there ways to bridge that gap? Where are there opportunities to ensure the safety of our kids while maybe not necessarily having a uniformed Phoenix police officer be at that school?
So would it be, would the agency then aid if there was let's say there was a crisis manager in the schools, a liaison with law enforcement? Because sometimes with this kid in Florida, the threat was identifiable, and in hindsight, there were a lot of signs that weren't seen. If there was a crisis officer in a school, someone that was able to bring that information together, wouldn't that be an asset without arming people, but at least the information of a bad student, a kid that's caused trouble, a troubled kid been hurting himself? Wouldn't that be an advantage to the agency to know that?
The more information, the better, so absolutely that would help. And just establishing those lines of communication so that information gets to us. the information doesn't help if it isn't shared, as I'm sure you can appreciate.
So it's tough enough. The city, I always say City of Phoenix is a wide city. It's not a tall city. It's got to be tough enough to patrol. But now on top of all of that, to be mindful of these school shootings, what is the conversation that goes on the day after?
So we try and learn as much information as we can, as quickly as we can, to assess our readiness to address a similar situation. As we discussed before, you can plan, you train, and we do. I mean, extensive training on active shooter intervention, run, hide, fight, which we teach to our citizens as well to adapt to the situation at hand. So we always try and look at how prepared we are, and then to push that information out to our officers to make sure they have the tools they need to address the situations when they occur.
Well, as always, we appreciate Phoenix PD willing to come down and talk to us here on the show. Thanks for the information, and especially thanks for your years of service.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks. We'll be back.